Time to get started. What would you like to research?
Shut your face.
That was the trailer for the 2014 short film Teacher in a Box by Tanuj Chopra, part of the series FutureStates that was produced by ITVS Television in about 2010 to 2014. And you're here back watching FutureStates Focus. My name is Joseph Orosco. I'm a professor of philosophy at Oregon State University, and I'm the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures. The Anarres Project is a forum for conversations, projects, and initiatives that imagine an alternative future free of oppression, exploitation, domination, war, and empire. And one of the projects that we maintain amongst many of ours is this series called FutureStates Focus, in which we do a deep dive into some of the future states episodes and try to make sense of them. FutureStates, of course, was this program that initiative that tried to bring together different BIPOC directors and ask them to imagine the future of the United States. And what's interesting about this series, of course, is that it features many stories that have prominent BIPOC actors and storylines. And so today we're going to talk about this short Teacher in a Box. And of course, my co-host for this series is Robyn Morris.
That's me.
Robyn is also an instructor of ethics at Xavier University. How are you doing, Robyn? It's been a while since we've done this.
It has. It's been like a year, right?
Almost. I was thinking about this. I think the last episode that we looked at together was back last summer. So that would have been maybe about 7 or 8 months ago. So
yeah.
Things have just been busy trying to manage life.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like the pandemic really throws a wrench into anything, particularly teaching.
Yes, that's right. And so part of the reason that we decided that we wanted to talk about Teacher in a Box is because both of us have had to do remote teaching for the past 8 months or so. And as many people around the world are doing, having to do some form of remote learning and remote teaching. And so we wanted to explore this idea of technology and teaching. We found this episode, Teacher in the Box, and we wanted to explore a little bit about what this episode is trying to say about teaching and the intersection of capitalism and technology. So let's talk a little bit about this episode.
Okay, so the way it starts out is it's very similar to what you see in the trailer, right? You've got the classroom, you've got the kids with their VR headsets on. You didn't really see this, but you actually have a real teacher. And our teacher for this episode, her name is Miss Rossi. And she is actually the teacher that they modeled the UI off of. So the UI, that teacher that you see in the virtual reality environment, that is her. Well, it's modeled after her. You get a sense that they're not really very alike. So she's got a student, her name is Rain. She is a troubled student, right? We find out that she's a foster child. She is being abused in her home, but she's also incredibly gifted in design. The way this school works is there's a big tech company that invests in the school and gives them technology to sort of teach with. You see that with the VR. And they then own any kind of patent or design or anything that the students then come up with, right? It turns out that this girl, she ends up designing the home of the future, right? And Miss Rossi makes a strong connection with her after the girl sort of points out that she thinks Rossi doesn't care about them, doesn't care about what she does. She digs a little at Rossi, saying like, you don't even know my name. What's my name? If you really care. But regardless, they do make a connection. She does sort of take Rain under her wing and saves her from her abusive family at the end. She says, you know, because this company buys the design for the house, they give her a house. But while it's being built, Mrs. Rossi says, why don't you come and live with me? And that's really where the episode ends.
Right. Let's take a look a little bit about the production details of Teacher in a Box. Is Tanuj Chopra's second film that he did for the FutureStates series. He actually did an earlier short called Pia in about 2010, and this was a much different story, though, you know, as we talked about, Robyn, it felt much more sort of emotionally resonant with me, but it's a much different kind of story with a lot of different kinds of themes. And so this is his Teacher in a Box is his second outing for this series. And so Tanuj Chopra is you can find him now on Twitter at Chops Films, and he's taught at Temple University, and I think currently he's in Los Angeles. He teaches there, I believe, for the LA film program that Temple University manages there, and he's still doing some films. A lot of different kind of romantic comedies. So not a lot of these kinds of speculative films anymore, as far as I can tell. But the main actors, of course, are Rebecca Hazelwood, who you see here on the left. She is Ms. Rossi. And here you see her is the teacher in the VR world, right? So this is what she looks like, prim and proper and everything, in the VR helmets. And so when the students are in the classroom, as you saw in the clip, with the helmets on, this is what they see in front of them. And so Ms. Rossi actually looks different in real life. And what's interesting about this, of course, is that, you know, all the students are in the classroom wearing the VR helmets, and then Ms. Rossi, the real one, is sitting at the desk in front of them all, and she's playing video poker, sort of, you know, totally alienated from the whole thing, bored and everything, and they're all just sitting in there with an avatar of her. So she was the prototype that the corporation used for the teacher in the VR world. And then the other main actor, Rain, is portrayed by Sarika Sanyal. And as far as I can tell, this was her only acting gig that she ever did. She went on, she works actually now in management of arts for a nonprofit in Los Angeles, but from what I can tell, this was the only time that she ever went in front of the camera. And so she portrays Rain, the troubled student, in this film, Teacher in a Box. And so this is a film about these two women and the way in which they find themselves in this technologically mediated teacher-student relationship. So what'd you think of this film?
You know, it brings up a lot of different themes, I think. One that resonated for me is the sense in which, you know, there's a question of whether we can really connect with students, not just in VR, but like out of person teaching in general, right? And I think that's a real concern for parents, particularly right now, given the pandemic. I know I have a lot of friends who have children who are in school virtually, and they're struggling. My children don't really struggle with that. So it sort of got me thinking about how we should diversify learning techniques and how we come at teaching for different students. The other thing I got to thinking about is sort of the exploitation that happens of these kids. It's and the way in which the economy drives what we're teaching and how we can teach, right? So, you know, we've seen the decline of the humanities,
right,
and the rise of STEM, right? Pushing students towards STEM because that's what's going to drive the economy. I mean, we've seen this over time, many times. It wasn't that long ago that every student, it seemed like, was going into computer science.
Right. Right.
And then, the market is sort of flooded with computer science. I can speak, I swear. and then we're forced to sort of recognize, hey, not everybody has to be an engineer. We don't,
Right.
in fact, have room in society for 33 million engineers. So it got me thinking about that, and about how the economy really sort of turns the knobs a lot of time, particularly in higher ed.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's interesting to think about like where we are right now in terms of education with remote learning in particular. So, as we're talking right now, this week, the Centers for Disease Control have issued their recommendations saying, what are the conditions under which schools can go back in the United States to teaching. And I was reading a report that said that something like, almost 90% of the world's children right now are in some kind of form of remote learning because of the pandemic. So a lot of people, and, different organizations like the United Nations are looking and asking the question about, are we going to have a kind of large gap in learning, a learning loss gap because of this? It has been the case in a lot of different school districts around the United States that school districts have just simply lost students. They don't know what happened to them. They haven't sort of checked in at the beginning of this year or the beginning of this academic year. And so in a lot of places, some students have just disappeared off of the maps for a lot of school districts. And so a lot of folks are, educators are wondering, like, what's going to happen to students? Is there going to be some kind of learning loss because this is not an optimal kind of environment for teaching? But on the other hand, right, as you were pointing out, the LA Times did do a kind of survey a few months ago and did find that there was a sizable number of parents in the LA school district who said, look, my kids are doing actually a lot better in this because, one, they're less stressed, right? Because they don't have to go to school. And for a lot of folks who are neurodivergent or have various kinds of anxiety issues, school can be a very triggering kind of experience. And so for a lot of those folks, these kinds of conditions are actually much better. But for a lot of other people who, for instance, experience bullying, a lot of parents in that survey that the LA Times did said that, their students were actually feeling much more healthier because they weren't subject to all the pressures of the school environment, which included a lot of violence, hostility, and bullying. And the other big thing too, what was really interesting was that a lot of the parents were saying that they said that their students felt a lot better because the school districts weren't pushing high stakes testing as much on them. Right. And so the instruction that they were getting wasn't so oriented towards, right, doing that test, 6 months into the year or at the end of the year. And so, because it's just a lot harder to do this kind of stuff, the high stakes testing has sort of not been a big priority. And students are responding by enjoying school a little bit more, at least what they get. And the other big thing that what they found was that at least for older kids, right, that they're getting more sleep.
Yeah,
right, which is a big
my kid
problem.
rolls out of bed at 5 minutes till her class starts.
Right, and so you don't have to. I was talking with my students is that the thing about the old normal is that there was a lot of wasted time going back and forth, commuting, right? That for a lot of people, essential workers still have to do a lot of this kind of traveling back and forth to jobs, but for a lot of people who have kids at home, perhaps they don't have to worry about getting their kids ready to go, breakfast, dress, and get them to there. And so there was this kind of sense, though, that for a lot of people, this is working okay. Or at least what it's indicating is that the old normal in terms of schooling put a lot of pressure on kids that was not particularly healthy for their mental health or their well-being, or even for their learning in some sense, because the worry that there's going to be a learning gap or a learning loss is usually measured by high stakes testing.
Right.
And so if there's less of an emphasis on that and students are responding favorably, you know, is the worry that students are going to learn less, whatever that means, really something that should drive us, pushing us back into the schools. But the big thing is this, I think, is that what all of this has revealed is how important schools are, not necessarily for learning, but simply for childcare.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so this is I think there's a lot of sort of questions about, like, are these moves driven by pedagogy, or are they just driven by economic pressures of parents who need to have better childcare in their lives? So I think that what's interesting about this the situation is kind of mirrored in the teacher in the box, is that our learning environments are really constrained in a lot of ways by economic pressures, like you were talking about,
Mm-hmm.
and not entirely or solely by the learning that's going on, but so much about what people do learn and what they're expected to know is driven by what corporations need.
Yeah.
Right. And corporations now, parents want to be able to send their kids because they're tired of them, perhaps, or they need them, after a year or so, or they need the childcare because they need help navigating their own lives.
Yeah, they need
Uh,
to work,
and
pay
they
the
need to
bills.
work, right? And that's again driven by the needs of the economy in various ways. And so I think that this short sort of brings to kind of, like, without knowing it, sort of brings to bear a lot of the kinds of pressures that we're seeing going on with education right now under the pandemic.
Yeah, I agree. I think as higher ed instructors and professors, we're granted a lot more flexibility with our courses, just in a general way, even outside of the pandemic. So we're able to sort of pivot easier than K through 12 is. And I think you bringing up that standardized testing, I think honestly, a lot of this inflexibility is a unfortunate byproduct of relying so heavily on standardized testing.
Mm,
And it's not just the
yeah,
curriculum can't be flexible because of that, but it's also, I think we've taught teachers that they have to teach in a particular way. And so they themselves can't be as flexible as they need to be to adapt to something like a pandemic, to
right.
adapt quickly to teaching online in an effective way, right? We are not giving them those skills, and that's translating to frustration from parents, frustration from some students that just don't do very well in that environment, right? Because
Yeah.
I think online learning can work, and it can be useful to students, but we have to be able to give teachers the flexibility that they need in order to do that. Um, and part of that is going to be not teaching to the test so much.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think something that was really interesting about the LA study, and I read some other studies too, is that what this moment indicates is, like, um, how there's some things really broken just in terms of teaching.
Mm,
Like, one of the things that the one study I was looking at was saying that what this indicates is that, like, teaching remotely like this or over Zoom, particularly for higher ed folks, but also for some K through 12 folk, is that one of the things that seems to fail a lot is that teachers and professors just like to talk a lot. And and what it's showing is that they tend to rely a lot on this kind of lecture mode, or just speaking to people and being less engaged. One study was showing that a lot of people just sort of turn off on Zoom after about, like, 5 or 10 minutes or so.
mhm.
And it's really, unless you're sort of doing a lot of engaged kinds of stuff, it can really sort of just be flat and deadening. And a lot of teachers are still trying to figure out, like, how to be engaged in that kind of way. But the worry is that maybe it's revealing how much we still rely on, what used to be called, right, the Paulo Freire kind of thing, the banking model of education, right?
Mm.
That I think that a lot of, I know that a lot of professors that I've been talking to struggle with trying to figure out, like, how do we deliver content And that already has a lot of sort of assumptions built into it about like what education is about. Like, is it an info dump into the minds of students? What makes this kind of interaction very difficult is because I think that, at least in what you and I do in philosophy, is so much built on conversation and sort of being able to see people's faces and respond to one another, and rather than just doing info dumps. So I think that these kinds of modes are sort of becoming more sophisticated and being able to have better engagement. But I think a lot of people still struggle with trying to do anything other than just like lecture.
Yeah.
And I think that's maybe a lot of students feel frustrated with that in a lot of ways, K through 12 and also I think higher ed. So I think that this is really challenging a lot of people to sort of figure out like how do they teach, what do they teach, and what are the pressures which they teach with. And I wanted to get to, and this is one of the things that I mean, we've been talking about like what this episode brings up for us about our current moment. But the film itself, for me, one of the things that I didn't like about this as much, Teacher in a Box, is that the story sort of kind of plays out in a way that's very, I don't know, maybe cliche in a way, right? It's sort of a cliche about the teacher story, right? I kept thinking, right, in the back of my mind, I kept hearing Coolio, right, when I was watching this, right? And that's an old school reference which the kids won't get anymore, but it's because
I get it.
Right. Well, you're old. That's why. Nah. No,
that song came up the other day on my way to work, and I was like, I still know every word of this song.
It's a classic song, right? But it was part of the soundtrack for that Michelle Pfeiffer film about teaching, Dangerous Minds, right? Where teacher comes in to rough inner city school and everyone's disconnected, and she comes in, she's a former Marine, right? Isn't that correct?
Yep.
Oh, no wonder you like that film, right? So she comes in and she's like, comes in and sets everyone straight, and she connects emotionally with the students. She goes in and out of her way to really bond with them, and there's some heartache, there's some death, because it's like a tragic. Of course, everything's tragic in the inner city,
yeah,
right? And and it's like not only is there the white savior kind of thing, but it's the teacher savior trope. And this sort of has that. I mean, there's no white savior here because, of course, we're talking about BIPOC actors. But I think that it has that teacher savior trope, right? Because Ms. Razi comes in, and initially she's sort of like, she's disconnected. She's got her own troubled backstory. Apparently, right? She had a really vicious divorce because she had a gambling
problem,
something like that. Anyway, she's got some issues, and she's doing this teaching. I don't know if teaching was really her. It's clearly not her passion at the moment in this school of innovation. But right then, when Rain comes in beaten up, she sort of takes her under her wing and then takes her out to the beach, and they have this conversation, and then they bond about the shared trauma. And like not letting trauma overwhelm you and ruin your future. And so, they become friends, they bond. So it relies on that kind of, what I think is a kind of overdone student teacher savior story. And so I was kind of like, that's not new.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think there's something to be said. It's much harder to connect with your students as the teacher in a box, right?
Yeah.
That's true. When she does that little dig at Miss Rossi about you don't even know my name, like that resonates with me because I put a lot of stock into learning every single one of my students' names. Like I make it a game that I have to know their names by the second week or something like that. You know what I mean? Because I want them to know that they're important in class. But there is some sense in which I think this goes too far. There's that point where she like takes her to the beach, right? Because she interrupts Rain being bullied by another student.
Yeah.
And she says, and she just pulls up in her car, right? And that's how she interrupts it. And then she's like, get in the car, let's go to the beach. I'm thinking to myself, like, that's inappropriate. Like, in what case does a high school teacher is it appropriate ever for any teacher really, but particularly a high school teacher, to pick up her own student, put her in her car and like take off to the beach together? So like I appreciate what they're trying to show, but yeah, it's cliche, it's overdone in that way. It's actually inappropriate and probably unsafe, you know?
Well, and it also, I think, thinking about that, I mean, part of that, I think the reason Ms. Razi does that is that she's kind of a rebel, right? She's a
Yeah.
rebel. She doesn't follow the rules, and,
Mm.
she sort of does inappropriate things. So maybe it could be justified that way. But then that creates an unrealistic sort of expectation about like how student teacher relationships could work, right? Is that that you have to really, as a teacher, you really have to go out of your way, out of your comfort zone,
Put
to
yourself in danger
yeah,
in
to
your
really
job.
emotionally connect with those people who really need you. And teachers have so many different kinds of responsibilities and legal obligations, and
Mhm.
to have that kind of expectation that you have to be that kind of a person, that's tiresome, right? That's why teachers burn out so much, right? Is
Right.
because of course they do run into students like Rain with those kinds of problems. That's realistic, right? And it's hard to deal
Mm.
with that. But you know it's trying to think of yourself as the teacher savior to all of your kids. That seems like a really quick way to either end your career or to burn yourself out emotionally, right? In a lot of ways, it's hard to sort of think about yourself as saving all of your children as a teacher.
Yeah, when Rain shows up to school and she does have, marks on her face from being beaten, there Rossi just does say, like, I have to report this.
Yeah.
But there's no sense in which it actually gets reported,
Oh, that's
because
a good point.
Rain shows up to school again later in the film, beat up again, right? I know that there are problems with social services, right? Maybe she just didn't get removed from the house, but I feel like if a child has very visible, and they were very visible, bruises on her face, um, they're likely going to be pulled from the house, but that doesn't seem to have been the case. So it leaves me with the feeling of like Rossi went and said, oh, well, maybe I don't need to do that. Maybe I can be her friend instead, or somehow save
Mm,
her, right?
right, right, right.
And I mean, I get this. I also teach at Prairie State College, and some of my students are dealing with very serious things like homelessness and stuff like
Mhm,
that. But
mhm.
I can't, as their professor, save them from that, right? The best that I can do is provide them with all the resources I have available to me, um, and hope that they take advantage of those. It sucks that you can't do more, but it's just teachers have so much else to do, particularly K through 12 teachers.
Right, right,
So
and
many
it
other
shows.
burdens.
Well, what it shows, I think, is that, which I think this film gets at in some senses, just like schools in general are at the intersection of so many different social forces in our society, and you see all of the kind of pathologies of our society erupting in the classroom, right? Violence, poverty,
Mhm.
hunger, right? All these kinds of things you're going to see in your students, and
Mhm.
teachers have to react to all of that. And what I don't like about the teacher savior story is that it doesn't kind of look at the bigger picture of the social structures that are leading children to have to do this. It
Right.
sort of says that the solution to this is to have that really one good teacher who will really fight for you and pull you out of this and then set you up, right, in some kind of way so that you'll be okay. But nothing else gets settled, right? And this leads to my sort of second kind of criticism of the film that you mentioned, right? Is that the whole premise of the film is there's this corporation uh, that produces this learning machine technology, right? The VR thing, and they've set up this school of innovation where they have these kids that I presume are a little bit gifted in design,
Mhm.
and then they teach them how to do building and structure, and then they take those designs and they monetize them, right? The corporation does. And so at the end of this, right, the corporation has taken Rain's ideas, done the house of the future, and is going to make millions of dollars off of these designs, and it's given her one of the houses out of charity, right? So
Charity.
it's out of she won the competition or something or other, but
Yeah.
really she's the whole thing is exploitative. The corporation is exploiting the labor of children right, to make billions, and then they give charity to some of the students so that it seems as though they're doing their social responsibility. And Rain and Ms. Razi are all part of that sort of system. And at the end, right, Ms. Razi and Rain are sort of, go off to check out Rain's new home or whatever. But, you're sort of left with still, there's this whole system of corporations that have gutted essentially education, I guess, to these child slave labor factories and these intellectual factories for them, right? All of that is sort of left in place. And it's sort of like, it ties into that teacher savior narrative, is like, it goes back to this kind of individual solution to social problems. And I don't think that actually ever works, right? You don't have individual solutions to social problems. You just have individuals maybe skating by, some individuals being lucky, and the rest of everyone else getting screwed. And like what happened to all the rest of her classmates who didn't win in the competition? They're screwed, right? And what do they have to look forward to? Who knows?
Right. Yeah, what's most, I think, dissatisfying about it is it's brought up explicitly too in the film. About in the middle of the film, right? Miss Rossi and her boss are at this dinner with two, executives from this corporation. And I don't know, they've just won some prize that they're, celebrating. And at one point, Miss Rossi is sort of standing at the bar by herself. You can tell that she's not really into this whole thing. She doesn't like it. And one of the executives comes to talk to her, and Miss Rossi goes, "Can I ask you a question? Why is it that you own all the patents to my students' work?" Right? And the person turns to her and says, "Are you saying I'm exploiting your students?" And Miss Rossi goes, "It's not a value judgment." I'm like, what do you mean? And it just seems so inconsistent with a kind of teacher that is going to like put her job on the line and really reach out to this girl to go, it's not a value judgment for me to point out that you're exploiting these students. So yeah, I agree. It's really dissatisfying. They don't really deal with it. And it does seem like that's what's getting promoted, is sort of these band-aids, like, oh, teachers need to take care of individual students, but let's not talk about the whole structure of the issue.
Yeah. And, I think that's worrisome, because I think that we tell that story a lot.
With a lot of different problems.
Yeah, with a lot of different problems. And there's some really great films, right? Like the Edward James Olmos classic, was it about Jaime Escalante. The name now is escaping me, but right, he's a teacher in East LA. We have
The Substitute.
Oh yes, there's also The Substitute, right? We have Dangerous Minds. Like, the story gets told quite a lot. And I think it's an interesting kind of way to highlight social problems of poverty and of race and all these kinds of things. But it's interesting that we just sort of get stuck in this kind of story that it always has to be some savior who is really going to pull this up, to teach people how to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. So it's a very kind of individualist kind of market mentality story that gets told over and over again. And so at least at the end of it, this film brings up a lot of issues, but I think doesn't bring, for me at least, a satisfactory solution to it.
Hell yeah, they should have been riding off in the sunset to tear down the system at the end.
They should have burned down that house, right? That's what
For
they should
real.
have done, right? They should have
In
said,
protest.
right? Or turn it into a commune or something or other for all the people who are apparently like losing their homes on the beach or something, right? So there could have been a different sort of take to this, but I liked it in the sense that it did give an opportunity to start thinking about what does it mean to be a teacher in the box, because I think that there's more and more pressure to that. And of course, we are now literally teachers in boxes, right? Boxes on the screens of our students for most of the time. And my students are mostly students in a box.
Yeah.
Right. I actually, this is very difficult for me to connect with some of them at all, because some of my students don't ever turn on their cameras. And so, right, all I ever see on the screen is a black box with a name at the bottom. I don't really know who these people are. I joked at the end of my last class last fall. I said at the end of the class, look, if once the new normal comes back and you see me on campus, come up and say hi, because I probably won't know who you are. But it'll be nice to meet you for the first time in person once we sort of get out of education in a box.
Yeah, you should ask them to like put up a picture, not necessarily their picture, but some picture that's meaningful to who they are, right? Doesn't even have to be them. It could be like a basketball, if they're a basketball fan, Kobe Bryant or something like that. Then at least something a little more like Kobe. And
Yeah.
it's so hard. It's so hard when you can't see their faces. I I'm in the I'm in a position where I might have to teach Kant and I won't be able to see my students' faces. And it's really scary to me because there's something, right? There's something that you need to say, like, okay, they are getting this. Like, whether it's their head nods, it's that nonverbal communication that lets you know, like, yeah, okay, they're reasonably tracking with what I'm saying. It's going to be so hard when it's just a recorded lecture that I don't see them and I have to just depend on them asking questions if they don't understand. Right? I don't know why asking questions is so hard, but
and I mean, as always, have to separate out between the remote teaching that everyone is doing now that we're talking about here, which is difficult, and lots of people are working really hard to make happen and work, versus sort of digital education, right? Or other stuff where that's, the idea is that you're sort of prepackaging asynchronous education, right? So that you don't have to be like in live with people, but it's this is a distance learning kind of thing that's growing popularity all across the world, right? Where people are learning at their own pace. That's a different sort of thing than the kind of thing we're talking about here, which is like, how do you connect through technology? And I have to say, I think that this is going to be with us. I think the teacher in the box thing is going to be with us more and more, and maybe we'll develop more and more strategies for figuring out how to do that kind of connection. And maybe that will help us develop better stories about how we can think about dealing with all the issues that we have to deal with, because in this kind of remote learning we also have those kinds of questions, right? About like, why don't my students have their cameras on? Where are they? I have had students who are in class in their cars because they don't have a place to sort of be in school. What about people who don't have any of this equipment to be able to do, right? So the big digital divide with all of this stuff is also one of those big questions about the social problems, right? And so
who has access to internet, even just internet, like
reliable internet?
There's so many households in the United States that don't have access to reliable internet, if internet at all.
Well, this is the problem, right? One of the problems that people are recognizing is, particularly for rural students, is that access to reliable high-speed internet is not a given. And so, what's going to happen to all these rural folk who, driving maybe many miles to go to a public facility where they can have, internet, if they do at all? These are big questions. And again, that's that sort of question that we've talked about, right? The focus so much on individual solutions to big social problems. It's a hope that this experience can help us think about strategies for addressing those social problems. But I think it means that we need to get rid of these stories or dampen them down, that, the solution to this is something that just about these heroic champions that will stand up for us.
Superhero teachers.
Yeah, superhero teachers, superhero politicians, any kind of savior. Right? Ultimately, that's why this episode falls a little short for me.
No, I get it. And I have to agree. I think that this is something that we're going to move forward with is um, a more online, more hybridized um, learning framework. I know, at SXU, we do a hybrid course. We
Yeah.
don't have, I mean, some courses are fully online, but particularly for our first year students, we have a hybridized system where I see, 1/3 of my class once a week, so that we can still social distance and I can still have that interaction, because even in higher education they understand that, like, particularly for first years, it's important to have that interaction with your professor, like your instructor, so that they can keep track of you. But again, that just sort of brings in the counselor bit again,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I don't know. I know you tend to teach like the more upper division courses, but like I don't know if you've ever felt this way, but with first year students, I often feel sort of like a counselor
Yeah.
to them too. Like, no, this is how college works,
Yeah. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of that. I think, and studies have shown that more and more folks are going into college, with all sorts of different kinds of also just mental health vulnerabilities
Mm,
that need attention by not just professionals, but faculty, right, and teachers. And so that part of our job is to be more aware of it, like you're talking about, of figuring out like how do we get our students into the right places,
right,
right? Recognizing that we can't be their counselor, and we can't be their savior, but
right.
we can get them into the hands of the people who are appropriate. But then the question is, are there always people that, this is the big question too, that a lot of students, I think, in higher education are facing right now is, are our schools prioritizing, right, mental health facilities, particularly in a pandemic, right? Like,
Hmm.
so with students having all these pressures, does the school really have the counselors and all these and different kinds of folk who can be there for them? And I think that that's also one of these pressures that needs to be considered, is what is the priorities that we're giving for students to be able to be successful, that doesn't create these pressures on faculty to do jobs that they're not trained to do.
Hmm.
Right. And so, and, with stories like this one, where it's sort of like, well, you're just going to have to be a little rebellious and step out of your role. That's a recipe for a lot of problems in a lot of different kinds of ways. And it creates problems for people who are particularly, vulnerable with mental health issues, is that, you shouldn't try to save folk if you don't have the skills to be able to do it. Right. That's what trained professionals are for.
Right. And in a lot of ways, we get trained to not do that, right?
Yeah.
A lot of our sort of sexual harassment training, stuff like that, is like, hey, if students come to you with these problems, do not try to be their counselor. That
Yeah.
is not your job, you know,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
because it really can just lead to exponentially more problems.
Yeah. I mean,
I
life
mean,
is complicated. Life is complicated.
is complicated. We don't need to make it more complicated. I mean, I don't mind being that person who's like, oh, yeah, that sucks that that's happening in your class, you know? But at the same time, it's sort of like, that's not what I'm here for. I'm here to teach you philosophy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's hard. It's hard. It's hard. Well, good. I'm glad we agree.
Yes, we often do.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, thanks for this deep dive into Tanuj Chopra's Teacher in a Box from 2014. I look forward to our next conversation. I don't know what we're going to look at next time, but we'll have a good
I don't
episode.
know
But
either.
thanks for the conversation. And I look forward to the next time we do this.
Yes, it will be fun. It always is fun. So,
Cool. Well, thanks, Robyn, and thank you all for showing up and spending a little bit of time with us. Let us know what you think. We'll put a link to Tanuj Chopra's Teacher in a Box. We'll also put in a link to his earlier short, Pia, which we were both talking about before. We prefer a lot better, actually, to Teacher in a Box. It's a lot more emotionally resonant for me, a little bit maybe darker in some kinds of ways. But maybe we can talk about that at some other time. We'll put a link to that one too. So if you have any comments, if you have some thoughts to share with us about education, teaching during pandemics, being a student during pandemics, send us a comment down below. You can find the Anarres Project on all the socials. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Let us know what you think, and check out some of our other Future States Focus videos that we've done. We've done a few of these looking at this series, and we hope to be able to come back and share some more of our thoughts on some of these other really fascinating short films that were produced that were really visionary in a lot of different kinds of ways. So we hope you'll join us with those. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Robyn.
Thank you.